There we go. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's now refueled and re-energised after their lunch and we're ready to press on. My name's Andrew Lind. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for Northern Studies at UHI, and it's my great pleasure to be introducing our next keynote speaker, Professor Steve Murdoch. Steve is a professor of military history at the Swedish Defence University and visiting professor at the Institute for Northern Studies. Having held posts at the universities of Aberdeen, St Andrews and Stockholm, he's genuinely one of the few scholars in our field who doesn't really need much of an introduction. And not to make him feel old, but over the last 30 years, Steve has been at the forefront of research on early modern military history and Northern European diplomacy. During that time, he's produced a vast array of journal articles, book chapters, translations, edited collections, but he's perhaps best known for his influential monographs, including Britain, Denmark, Norway and the House of Stuart, Network North, Scottish Kin, Cultural and Covert Associations in Northern Europe, The Terror of the Seas, Scottish Maritime Warfare, and with Alexia Grosjean, Alexander Leslie and the Scottish Generals of the 30 Years' War. Today, Steve will be turning his attention back to the cold and often turbulent waters of the North with his paper titled Controlling Maritime Violence, Comparative Sea Laws in the North Sea and Baltic between 1500 and 1650. A very warm welcome to Steve.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew, for that introduction. I don't think I'm as famous as people think I am. I hope not. What I'm going to be talking about today, I know quite a lot of you who are in the room today. I don't know everybody. For those of you who haven't read my work or don't know my work, I wouldn't really say that I'm a scholar of maritime or military history per se, but more a general interest in early modern transnational history, perhaps, but certainly the interactions across the North Sea and Baltic worlds. And what I'm going to talk about today is going to be a return to some of the themes I looked at in my earlier work, which is maritime warfare. And in particular, I'm going to have a rethink about some of the work I did previously and some of the work that continues to interest me on maritime law. In particular, who controlled maritime violence at sea in the Baltic and in the North Sea region. As I have indicated, I'm a generalist rather than a specialist, but the early work that I did on maritime conflict, which was particularly looking at Scottish privateering against neutral Swedish vessels in the 1670s and 80s, led to an invitation to come to Stockholm University to take up the Olof Palme Professorship in Peace Studies. And it was from there that I deepened my knowledge of the work that I'd kind of hinted at in Terror of the Seas about the control of the laws of war and the laws of war on the ocean in particular. And why I find this fascinating is that in the course of writing some of these earlier journal articles, I found some documents which seemed somewhat flippant or somehow disingenuous in the way that they referred to maritime war. For example, here, in the sentencing by the English Admiralty Court of the Andrew of Gothenburg in 1652, there's a very curious line, which I've highlighted here, which suggests that the Andrew was taken by virtue of reprisals, rightly and lawfully, and according to the laws of nations. Now, there's a few things in that sentence that need to be looked at more deeply. Why was England fighting a reprisal war against a neutral country? Reprisal is something very specific in maritime war. We're going to come to it in greater detail later on. But the one that really got me when I was focusing on the subsequent research after the Terror of the Seas was what is meant by the law of nations. Has there ever been something that we can constructively say represents a law that all nations adhere to? Can we even see it today when some nations will act in a particular way and appeal to law only when it suits themselves? So this particular document was the first of many that got me thinking, okay, what are the laws of nations and how does this impact on the conduct of maritime warfare at sea. For those of you who have looked at this before, you cannot look at maritime warfare in a Mediterranean, Baltic, or North Sea context without tripping over the Rôle d'Oléron from the 13th century. And this is one of these sets of maritime codifications of law that is excellent. It's often misquoted, but actually, what does it say? And Timothy Runyon said quite clearly that it is one of the laws that had to be implemented because mariners going to sea were used to their own laws, their commercial law or their conventional law, but there was nothing that actually said what happened when a mariner and a ship went from one jurisdiction to another. And Runyon was very clear that the law was recognised in England simply because the common law of England couldn't handle the unique problems presented in maritime cases, and it was unable to render equality to the mariners. So they had to look to this internationalisation of law. That's all very well, but what did it actually mean? And the Rôle d'Orléans was only one of several laws which were put out in the late medieval period. The other one that is consistently referenced is the maritime law of Visby, also known as the Gotland Water Law, or beg your pardon, as the laws of Gotland. And like the Rôle d'Orléans, this was a set of laws which was there to protect the mariner, the merchant, the ship owners, but it wasn't directly there to say how one should behave in a time of armed conflict. The Visby Sea Law was adapted into several languages. It appeared in Danzig, in Copenhagen, in Stockholm, in Amsterdam, and it is cited by later Scottish and English law from the late 16th, early 17th century as being foundational. But I think the key thing here is that it's foundational in that it sets the tone for internationalization of law, but it is not something that we can actually say deals with the law of war. We start in the early 16th century to get something a bit more concrete with Gustav Vasa's Sjöartiklar from 1635, the Sea Articles. And in these Sjöartiklar, this is a document that is published alongside the Krigsartiklar, or the Articles of War. And it is quite clear that there is an assumption here within the Sea Articles, which is this is a code of conduct for discipline aboard a ship. If you strike the master, then you will get your hand cut. If you steal anything, then we will have something to say about it. But there are three of the codes which mention something about war, and they're very, very subtle. Article 4 says if you desert the flag in the face of the enemy and retreat, you'll forfeit your life. So the implication is there that you are possibly going to be endangered. Anyone who gambles his weapon or sword will be held in disgrace. Okay, so now we know that the crew are armed, and you're only armed if you're preparing for violence. And Law 21, everyone is expected to help the gunners, presumably in time of war, and anyone who refuses is to be thrown overboard. So it's this subtle implication of war, rather than something that says this is what you do in war, that is a feature of early modern Scandinavian and Northern European sea laws. Gustav Vasa later updated his laws in 1559. These articles, the Sea Articles of 1559, were specifically for a fleet destined for England. And we can see that 9, 10, 11, 12 are all about what you must do in times of conflict, or the implication of conflict. We see some of the same laws being repeated, like number 11, all gunners must be attentive and oversee their guns. Any gunner who fails to do his duty forfeits his life without mercy. No firing of guns wantonly on board ships. All aboard ships are required if the need arises to assist the gunners, etc. But it's the final law here, number 16. This is the one that actually tells us where the Scandinavians, or at least the Swedes, are deriving their right to conduct warfare at sea. It actually states space does not allow here, but the default is that everyone must obey our gårdsrätt. And if we wanted to translate that, we would say manorial law, the law of the manor. And what this is doing is Gustav Vasa is basically saying the captain of the ship is the lord of his manor. He exercises the same rights on his own little territory as a baron does on his particular estate back in Sweden. So what we've got with the Swedes is there are other laws out there. You should know what they are, but here what we're going to do is lay out for you how you conduct yourself aboard a vessel, but without telling you what you need to know to actually conduct war. If we look to the other Nordics, Denmark, Norway, Frederick II also put out a much more extensive set of laws. But like the Rôle d'Orléans and the Visby Sea Laws, these are more commercial in nature rather than military. Frederick's very good of giving us an opening paragraph as to why we need sea laws, because, as he says, our kingdoms and territories, their islands and coastal towns are all situated along the sea. And it's by God's providence that our subjects should get their food and earn their keep mainly from maritime trade, exporting and importing fish goods and other branches of seafaring. But in this extensive law, which is much, much longer than the Swedish ones, we only have two laws that really imply anything about warfare. Article 20, should a vessel be attacked by enemies and pirates, the crew defends itself. And if this leads to the wounding of crippled men, the skipper is obliged to let them heal. But the medic's fee and the provisions of fees are to be covered provisionally between the vessel and not from the goods that have been taken. And Article 50, should freebooters or pirates approach, the vessel is loaded with loose goods such as wheat, then this shouldn't be impacted on the major commercial purpose of the fleet. But I think in Article 32, we get a real sense of what the code is all about. Anyone who wastes or abuses the skipper's beer and food and is proven to do so by reliable crew members must be set ashore without salary or without provisions. So what we're getting here is a set of laws where only two have got any implication about how to deal with violence, and both of those are specifically mentioning piracy rather than large-scale naval battles. Carl the Ninth, but only when he was Duke Carl, wrote something a bit more specific, which is the Sjörätt och Skeppsartiklar of 1570, the Sea Rights and the Ships Articles of 1570. He is now extending his father's earlier works, and it's the usual kind of conduct for rules aboard. However, we do get the idea that danger from an enemy is implicit in these articles. Should any captain or skipper desert the fleet when fighting the enemy or fails to help any of the crew, they're deemed a traitor and punished accordingly. Thievery against His Grace's subjects or anyone else at sea, i.e. don't become a pirate, unless you're specifically told to do so, then this is something that is punishable by death. We're back to the conduct of all gunners must take care of their guns, gunpowder and lead shot. A gunner who does not do this will be punished, and if it happens in front of the enemy, he'll be taken as a man without honour, and if it happens at other times, he'll be keel-hauled. So we do get this implicit idea that war is now more real, war is more likely. The code of conduct to keep people safe aboard a ship is now extending to deeper violence at sea. We also get that in Article 42. It's forbidden to demand a ransom from a prisoner, even if a prisoner is willing, and they must remain captive until the authorities decide their fate on pain of death. Well, that's interesting, because how do you get a prisoner if you haven't been involved in some kind of military action? At the same time as the Swedes and the Danes are putting out sea laws, then we get William Fleetwood in England trying to codify what violence at sea looks like, or what maritime law looks like for the English jurisdiction. In his certain notes declaring admiralty jurisdiction in 1568, it is moving back towards Oleron and to Visby, but he does put in the fact about admiralty jurisdiction and that at sea, all offences done at sea, the captain has got entire authority, and that is also again focusing on piracy rather than on the battle fleet. And yet, in a lot of the articles that one reads about war in the North Sea and Baltic, Fleetwood and the Role of Orleans and the Visby Sea Laws are cited as the underpinning foundations of maritime violence. One of the best scholars of medieval codifications of maritime law is Edda Francot, who has written widely on the Role d'Orléans and the Visby Sea Laws, amongst others. And she said something very interesting in the 2020 edition of the Stair Society, which is that medieval maritime law had come forth from legal practice. It was not a learned law and had been written in the vernacular from its inception. And as such, until the second half of the 16th century, when James Balfour included sea laws in his practice and William Wellwood wrote his Sea Laws of Scotland, learned lawyers may have had very little knowledge of maritime law. Maritime law was customary. It was what you did and what you knew from your own situation in your own port. It's not often I disagree with Edda, but one thing I will say is that the Sea Law of Scotland is not the work of William Wellwood that discusses maritime violence. In 1590, he wrote his treatise, The Sea Laws of Scotland. And in the table of contents, it's quite clear that the only part of maritime violence that is discussed is, again, piracy. Now, is that because, are all these sea laws focusing on piracy because piracy is a bigger threat than full naval battle? My suspicion is yes, and I'll come back to that later on. But Wellwood's Sea Law of Scotland is good for a number of reasons. Here you see him directly quoting the law of Rhodes, the Role d'Orléans, and stating that common law is not good enough to handle the problems that are set up by the new realities of battle fleets, piracy, and the burgeoning early early modern times. It's actually James Balfour, 7 years earlier, who's the first to properly codify rather than simply reference. I mean, he does say, I'm going back and drawing on the sea laws of James IV. He mentions James V. But here he actually articulates in a very specific way the job of the admiral, his office, and his jurisdictions. And here he makes it quite clear that this isn't just about looking after the rivers and the shoreline, the territorial waters, the firths and the fjords, or the islands of Scotland. This is in time of peace and in time of war, that he is as effective in controlling the maritime assets of the nation as he is the commercial fleet. For those of you who haven't read Balfour's practice, and I'm sure many of you have, it is really a step forward. And in this, Edda's right. This is the first time that lawyers are actually setting out what is it to go to war and what do we do in situation A, B, and C. How do we deal with pirates? How do we deal with enemy ships? How do we deal with privateers? In addition to all the other sea laws that you need to know about flotsam, jetsam, trade, commerce, and individual violence aboard ships. There are some key parts of Balfour's practice that we should tease out, and that is the way that Balfour decides the way that neutral vessels or neutral ships should be treated in war. And it's a very important aspect here, because unlike other codifications, he's explicit that any neutral vessel if you claim to be neutral, but you carry anything that can be of use to the enemy, then it's not just the goods which could be used by the enemy that are to be confiscated, it is the ship itself that will be confiscated. And that has implications for what happens later on in the 17th century, where Scots law is pointed at by European neutral nations and enemies alike as being something perhaps unnatural, something a little bit perhaps too severe. But of all the lawyers that you probably know, we have to think of Hugo Grotius and his text from 1609, Mare Librum. Now, Mare Librum is still amongst the most influential of 17th century legal works pertaining to the maritime world. It poses crucial questions of free access to the sea and issues of oceanic space as something impossible to control and appropriate. Grotius provided the argument that the sea naturally cannot be possessed. It's too big, it's too vast. But this is in contrast to land, which can be acquired, transformed, and possessed. And this in itself has implications for violence at seas and who was responsible for authorising and adjudicating that violence. If we look back to the Scottish wars of the early 16th or mid-16th century against the Netherlanders, this is about the right to fish at sea. It's who can and who cannot fish at which part of the North Sea. And of course, this was already argued in the time of James IV. We'll hear a bit about that later, perhaps. And Grotius is making an argument here to justify the Dutch position, but only the Dutch position when it comes to the North Sea and the Baltic, because this same lawyer, when he writes about going to the Dutch East Indies for the VOC, he writes about the closed sea and the fact that the Dutch and the Dutch alone have got the right to possess the seas around their islands. And this, of course, is a treatise that's designed to attack against the Portuguese and the Spanish and also the English. It's fair to say that Mare Librum was not popular from the outset. And it's in fact our old friend William Wellwood from St Andrews who comes back at Grotius with a very, very strong attack in his work De Domini Maris on the possession of the sea in 1615. And in the latter, Wellwood questions Grotius's use of natural law as a basis for the Mare Librum doctrine and argued, himself citing scripture and using customary law for the appropriation of the sea as a closed sea. But where Wellwood and Grotius could actually come together was that that should be in coastal waters. The idea of having an offshore limit, how far out to sea is actually possessed by a potentate. So this actually put Grotius into something of the doldrums, and he didn't actually write anything major for a long time after the attack by Wellwood. And people were expecting at the time it would be the Portuguese or the Spanish who would fight him, but it was in fact his own allies from Scotland. Another important attack on Grotius's use of Mare Librum was by the English jurist John Selden. Selden very much builds his work on Wellwood's arguments, but his spectacular work, Mare Clausum, or the Dominion of the Ownership of the Sea, came out in 1635, but didn't actually gain the popularity that one might think until the Anglo-Dutch Wars of the 1650s, when it became something of a cause célèbre and something that the English Cromwellian regime could use when attacking the Dutch. But Selden is nevertheless somebody of significance, more popular than Wellwood, I think, largely because of where he came from and the readership that he had. So we've talked a lot about the codifications of war. So now we'll just have a brief look at the types of maritime violence at sea. If we look to the four main types of maritime violence at sea, the one that has come up in every tract so far is piracy. Piracy, the last one in this list, is unregulated violence at sea, which occasionally results in warfare, and it's internationally condemned. Piracy is also problematic. In times of civil war, it can be very easy to deem the people on the other side as pirates, like the Cromwellian regime declared Prince Rupert's fleet to be a pirate fleet, and in the 1690s, the Williamite regime in Scotland and England declared all Jacobites to be pirates. And it was seldom enforced, but it nevertheless was there in statute. The other type, if we go back to the top of the list, is crown warfare. And crown warfare was declared by the monarch, regent, or appropriate authority. It's sanctioned by convention and sometimes by international treaties. Civilian ships taken under the practice of crown warfare, it's called guerre de course, is a form of naval privateering. But let's be clear, the purpose of crown warfare is not to capture civilian ships. The purpose of crown warfare is to sink the enemy, to kill the opponent's navy. And in terms of maritime violence, it's actually not nearly as controversial as the next two, letters of marque and letters of reprisal. And to give you some insights there, if we look at the number of crown ships or state ships that are lost between the Dutch and the English in the First Anglo-Dutch War, we're talking in hundreds. But if we're talking about civilian vessels taken in that same 2 or 3 year period, we're talking upwards of 8,000. That's 8,000 ships. That's several 100,000 people involved by the time you count crew, investors, families. So actually, crown warfare, although it's perhaps the most spectacular, is not as detrimental and not as prevalent as letters of marque or letters of reprisal or even piracy, which is why perhaps people focus on the latter and not the former. Now, letters of marque and letters of reprisal are actually quite misunderstood. Very often, if you go to the index of most books about maritime warfare, you'll see that the index will have pirates and privateers framed under the same term in the index. This is something I've been banging my gums on about for about 20 years, and I'll never stop. Letters of marque and letters of reprisal are in most jurisdictions, except England and latterly the Dutch, two completely separate things. A letter of marque is issued so that one can conduct warfare by private men of war on behalf of the state, authorised by the Lord High Admiral or his deputy, sanctioned by international bilateral treaties, and it can vary in usage between states. It is, in fact, civil or civilian, sometimes naval, privateering. That means that if we go to war with the Dutch, then you see a Dutch ship. I've now put down a deposit of £2,000 sterling to the Admiral as a way of guaranteeing that I won't become a pirate. And for as long as my letter of marque is valid, I can take the enemy ships and their cargoes. And this is good for the state because it's a cheap way of the state conducting economic warfare against an enemy. And it's also gives the commercial fleet something to do when it might be harder to trade. So that's letters of marque are probably the most common form of warfare in the early modern period. Less well known, but often confused and conflated, are letters of reprisal. It's a regulated practice which allows an individual who's been wronged by another individual to recoup their loss by allowing them to seize goods belonging to the city, state, or kingdom to whom his tormentor belonged, sanctioned by international convention, sometimes conflated by marque. My old friend James Balfour, when he's talking about letter of marque in his work, he actually means letter of reprisal, just for those of you who are taking notes. So what are letters of reprisal and can they lead to war? Well, the process for granting a letter of reprisal, most of the cases I've studied take up to 20 years before a letter of reprisal is granted. And that's because all sides agree that all other legal avenues and interventions have to be exhausted. You first have to go to your local district court, you then go to the higher court of the land, you then go to your monarch or potentate, you then go overseas to the place where you believe the crime against you has been committed, and only if there is no other legal satisfaction is a letter of reprisal granted. And that letter of reprisal means that you have to do that same thing where for every ship you put to sea, you put down a £2,000 sterling deposit, and that is so that you avoid piracy. Now, there are cause célèbre cases of Scottish reprisal wars. The Barton Portuguese reprisal war is one of those. It goes on for a very long time. It's eventually ended by Act of Parliament in 1563. And in the end, the successors to the Barton family are selling, or rather leasing, the letters of reprisal out to all comers, so that Englishmen, Spaniards, and Dutchmen all have Scottish letters of reprisal against the Dutch. And the problem there is, go back up, the reprisal should cease once satisfaction for loss has been gained. But that doesn't mean that you have the equivalent of the money that you lost. It means you have the equivalent for the money you lost, plus the legal fees, often up to 20 years. And actually, what about the personal satisfaction? What if you feel injured, hurt? Then you can keep this war going for a long, long time. There are also times when reprisal wars come from a letter of reprisal. The Hamburg Reprisal War started in 1628 when a Scottish ship, which had been brought into Royal Naval Service, was taken by Hamburg privateers in Bergen in Norway. They took down the Royal Standard and jumped up and down in it. And this led to Charles I issuing a letter of reprisal immediately without any due process. But nevertheless, once he had started the process, that war went on until 1643, and it was only the turmoil of the Wars of the Three Kingdoms which actually ended that process. The hurt for having his flag jumped up and down was probably ended with the taking of the first 2 or 3 ships. But as Katrin and I both know, because we've both looked at the papers, this was a war that cost Hamburg over a dozen vessels and hundreds of thousands of Riksdaler. Letters of reprisal fall out of use after the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which, although it still recognises them, imposed conditions that effectively rendered them obsolete. And for those who are interested in such things, there's only one Western nation left on earth, I believe, that still has the right to issue letters of reprisal, and that's the great United States of America, which under the present government makes me somewhat nervous. Privateering then, as opposed to the other forms of warfare, is something different. When we think of battle fleets coming together, we're thinking of 2 Royal Naval ships or 2 state navies trying to kill the other ship. But what happens in privateering is you don't want to damage the ship and you don't want to damage the cargo. So there's actually a very specific privateering method, which many people don't consider, in which Captain Thomas Phillips of a Royal Africa Company ship kindly wrote down to us in his navigation journal. He talks about an assault on the Africa ship by a French privateer. And he's very specific that the Frenchman fired high. He's trying to take down the masts and the rigging so that he can take the ship and the crew and the cargo intact. But that's not what Phillips wants. Phillips just wants this guy to go away. So when he talks about how he fought, he's firing into the hull. He's trying to kill the privateer, and I mean the ship and captain. And he's very clear here. With our demi-culverin, we constantly, with both double and round shot, we shot through the quarterdecks, tin cases full of musket balls, so we must certainly have killed a great many men. 5 days later, he writes in his journal again, and he estimates the death on that the death rate on that privateer as 240 individuals killed or severely disabled. So it's a different kind of warfare to the battle fleets just trying to kill each other. A privateer is trying to capture the vessel. If the privateer can't capture the vessel, he can't make his money back. One of the best examples we have of prize taking and privateer warfare comes in the 4 later wars of the 17th century. That's the 3 Anglo-Dutch wars and the 9 Years' War. And I wrote something about this in the Breaching Neutrality article, which was interesting because when Cromwell took over from the Stuarts, he actually, or rather his naval fleet and his admirals, decided to tear up everything that Selden and Wellwood had written about maritime law. They wanted to go back to the glory days of England, and they wanted to reintroduce privateering as it had been in later Stuart England. And if we look at ships' prizes captured by British privateer, on the very left-hand side, we can see that between 1650 and 1654, there's a rise. The red is English. No Scottish ships are at sea as privateers. That's no surprise. But the English are actually doing a considerable amount of damage this is just the Swedish neutrals. You can do this chart again for the Danes, and you can also, when you go to the Dutch, 3,500 Dutch ships taken prize by English privateers. It's a monumental form of warfare. And when I said that they're tearing up the law, they really are. So here's a letter to the Swedish resident Benjamin Bonnell in England in 1654, and the master of the Swedish ship from Nyköping, Gabriel Corneliusson, says quite specifically that as well as being abused himself physically, the captain of the ship, Captain Treasure, said that he valued not the passive or royal majesty of Sweden, but would wipe his posterior with it, along with other scandalous language. And there was a period here in the Anglo-Dutch Wars where it was a free-for-all, where England, Cromwellian England, not recognised initially after the execution of Charles I by any European monarch. It took until after the conclusion of the Anglo-Dutch Wars before Cromwellian England started to get recognised. And since they weren't recognised, they recognised nobody else's authority at sea. It had consequences, however, because when you think about what the Anglo-Dutch Wars were, given the privateering, given the naval fleets, they were big business. Most of the naval supplies for the English Cromwellian Navy was coming from Sweden or out of the Baltic. And so this business, as Bulstrode Whitelock said in 1654, English privateering, and the stay of so many ships is a big talk here in Sweden. And I earnestly entreat you to be insistent with the council in this business. It seems strange to me that a ship having the Queen's Pass and my Lord Lagerfeld's should be seized, especially in this time of treaty, and it cannot be discharged. This is after the Swedish treaty, Anglo-Swedish Treaty of 1654. Now, there was also a problem with the Anglo-Dutch Wars. It took place under the Cromwellian regime. There was something like £350,000 sterling owed to English merchants, and British merchants indeed, by the English government. The treaty was signed in 1654, again 1656, again 1658. But when Charles II reassumed his throne in 1660, he basically said, "Not my problem, not my war." However, the Treaty of Whitehall was established to make sure that such events couldn't happen again. No merchants, captains, and masters of ships engaged for any public service or expedition of war or any other cause, much less for private use, be seized, embarked, arrested, forced by violence, or be any other way molested or injured. It's a nice thought. However, the Treaty of Whitehall only included the Kingdom of England. Scotland was excluded. And so if you look at the privateering against Swedish ships in 1665 through to 1674, English privateering against Sweden drops to almost nothing, whereas Scottish privateering is on the increase. There are several reasons put forward for this. One is that the Scots wanted to show loyalty to their new royal master. Secondly, the Scots had lost so much commercially during the Cromwellian period. They're trying to recoup the gains, especially now that the Americas had been closed off for their commerce. But there was something else that the Scots were doing which seemed a bit strange to the rest of the legal world. And that was something which later becomes known as the law of continuous voyage. The Scots started to take prizes of neutrals and enemies which had no cargo in them at all. And if the ship is not carrying cargo, how can you possibly arrest it? What they argued was that for a long time in Scotland, that you could arrest a ship not because it was committing a crime, but because you knew it had committed a crime. So rather than sitting off, let's say, the port of Gothenburg to capture a ship full of cargo, you could actually take them sitting off Madeira when they're on the return journey with a cargo of wine. And if you could find the manifest that said they had carried contraband, then they were taking them prize. This particular letter of marque from 1628 was issued in Swedish, in German, in Dutch, in Scots, and in Latin, and it was something of a shockwave because it was a new innovation, and people were basically saying the Scots have just made this up, and in that they may be correct. The case in particular was the Griffin of Stralsund, and it says, and Leoline Jenkins, the Welsh judge from the English Admiralty Court, said, according to the proclamation of war, the custom and law of England, from whence war and peace and treaties do come, where your lordships before said do send for advice, that Scotland cannot be abstracted in those movable ordinances of peace and war, who are regulated by the chance of time, much less mutual treaty, wherein all His Majesty of the King of Great Britain's subjects are included. Well, that was interesting because this was probably one of the earliest cases of an English common lawyer trying to take on Scottish Roman law legal system. And it'll come as a surprise to nobody that the Swedes agreed. Such proceedings by the Scots are against the amity which are against our and the English crown, and are against the freedom and the alliance with the King of England for our subjects. The Griffin was condemned. The Lords of Session asked for a final decision on whose law the case should be judged, and Charles II himself clarified that it had to be decided according to the laws of Scotland. Sir George Mackenzie later published the defence case in 1673 and concluded that the Lords jointly sustained the adjudication, but were still not sure about that continuous voyage debate. So the Griffin was condemned because it did have some other cargo on it, but the continuous voyage was still something of an abstract subject. And so the wars continue, 1671 to 1674. There's a massive spike. Now the Scottish privateers have been unleashed on a proper scale. They're taking the Swedes if they believe that they can carry any kind of contraband cargo. What the nature of contraband itself is challenged. Now they're also introducing such things that if the captain or enough of the crew are Dutch, that makes them enemies. It makes it an enemy ship. So we're going to condemn that too. And this nuancing, continual refining of the law leads to a protracted series of cases, a correspondence that does not end until 1713. But at the same time, English lawyers are starting to have a look at what the Scots are doing. And they have, of course, state the obvious: the goods of an enemy in a friend's bottom may be fully seized. So you can take the goods, but the friend's bottom will not be seized. You can't take the ship. That is against the Scottish law of Balfour. Having double passes and false passes are not grounds for confiscation, but offering them in evidence is. So even if people are obviously there and showing that they're keen to fool you as to what their duty is, as long as they don't try to use them as evidence, they haven't committed a crime. No number of mariners or masters being Dutch will lead to confiscation. The English have looked at Scots law and said, no, we don't agree with you there. If a ship is taken after having unloaded contraband, she can't be claimed prize. They're maintaining they don't agree with the continuous voyage. But confession and deposition of a master and crew could now condemn a ship despite papers that contrary English Admiralty has just absorbed Scottish prize law. Let's look to these last two spikes of 1689 to 95 and 1701 to 1704. These are particularly the second one, the greatest moments for English privateering. Now the English are back in the game. Why is that? Because they've just had regime change again, and nobody cares what the Stuart deal with the Swedes was. It's a free-for-all. If we look at the list of neutral ships claimed by the Swedish subjects in 1694 and their values, then it amounts to quite a pretty penny. Over £800,000 sterling is what's claimed since 1691 to 1694. But the Swedes have not been sitting idly by. And this is where we get perhaps the last major innovation that I'm going to talk about in legal warfare at this point. Johann Gröning was a German Swede from Lubeck who wrote his PhD thesis called Navigatio Libera, Unimpeded Sailing. The first edition, his thesis, comes out in 1693. It's circulated to lawyers such as Samuel Pufendorf, and he then reissues it in 1698 with an extended introduction. It's possibly the greatest attack on Grotius in the 17th or 18th century. In his book, he proposes that one party has taken up arms justly and the other unjustly is hazardous. You can't just say that. It's fallacious and doubtful because each of the belligerents always maintains that his enemy is keen on an unjust cause of war, but that they themselves are waging or supporting it justly. This publication did not reach a major international market, but it does set the foundation for American laws of neutrality after the revolution. But it doesn't seem to go anywhere within the other major maritime powers. Nevertheless, Navigatio Libera was only one part of a strategy to curb that English privateering against neutral Swedes. And it led to possibly the unthinkable, the Nordic League of Armed Neutrality of 1693. The two traditional enemies of Sweden and Denmark come together to discuss such matters as convoy systems, as belligerent warfare against the great maritime powers. And the Danes were the first to launch the attack when some English privateers come and try to arrest a Danish vessel. They actually go out of their way to destroy that ship. You will go to war to defend your neutrality and your right to be at peace. What's perhaps more important, if you look at the date of this, the 17th of March, 1693, already it is sent to one of the belligerent nations in April, just the following month, where the treaty is discussed and the treaty itself is sent to Louis XIV. And Louis XIV himself says that this is the basis by which we should deal with neutrals. So it's not just an intra-Nordic league or interest to the intra-Nordic League, it's also something that very quickly manifests itself into the wider North Sea and Mediterranean region. By 1694, the Maritime Law of Florence actually adopts the Nordic Treaty. But it's the idea that this League of Armed Neutrality is backed by actual belligerents that is important. If we look towards the next war, the War of Spanish Succession, starting in 1701 to 1704. The War of Spanish Succession goes on for a lot longer, to 1709. But you'll notice there's a sudden stop in English privateering, which happens in 1704. And this will be my final case study for the moment. And that is the degree to which the Scandinavians will protect their right to neutrality. The Battle of Åland in 1704 is perhaps one of the best known, in Sweden at least, defences of the right of neutrality. It starts off when 8 English 50-gunners approach a convoy escort, which is also a 50-gunner, and it's captained by a man called Zilander. Zilander has been given a letter from the Swedish king to fight to the death if anybody was to try to challenge the Swedish flag or make the Swedish convoy lower the Swedish flag. Ironically, the convoy of about 50 ships that he's escorting is taking English naval supplies to Portsmouth so that they can continue the fight in Europe. The English can continue the war against their enemies abroad. But this one ship, Zilander, was obviously a man of a certain substance. He decides to fight to the death against his 8 English opponents, and he eventually does fight until there's only a few men left standing. He's taken prisoner and he's tried, but they don't know what to try him with. He said, "Would you not defend the honour of your flag?" My king's flag is as worthy as your flag, and you must respect it. You must respect our right to trade. This Anglo-Swedish skirmish in the Channel is the last great act of the early modern period in defending neutrality. Although there wasn't a League of Neutrality with Denmark at this point, the Danes start to speak about reimposing it. From this point until the end of the war, privateering losses against the English dropped to virtually nothing. There's a few left in 1712 and 1713, but it is this ability to fight to preserve the right to be neutral that ends the codes of conduct for maritime violence at sea in respect to neutral trade in this period. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. Lots of incredibly interesting stuff there. I learned a huge amount. I was scribbling notes all the way through that. But I will open the floor to